How's everybody doing today? You're watching Slot Car Mayhem. I'm John, and this will be episode 26 of the Glendale 65. And today we're going to talk about making a pit lane separation wall. In this case here, I'm showing two examples. Neither one of them are completely finished, but both of them I'm showing different techniques here. This one is cut out of MDF. This one is cut out of foam core. And if we look at this wall, a lot of people don't like to use foam core because it generally has a pretty poor look, where you can see the foam and it just doesn't look very nice at all. Well, in this case here, you can see I've got a really nice look all the way around. It's nice and smooth. It doesn't look like foam core at all, even on the ends. If we look at the bottom, you can tell it's foam core. So I'm going to show you some of the techniques I use to achieve that look, and why for my pit lane wall I'm choosing to use foam core instead of MDF. Okay, one of the first things we got to pay attention to is how long is the wall going to be. In my case, I'm going to do one continuous piece. It's going to be about 75 inches in length. That being said, if we look here and if we can see a little dip right here in the track. I don't know how well it shows up on the camera, but we got about a 1/16 of an inch or so gap right here where the track kind of bends down and comes back up right here. So we need to make sure that we capture these contours for the bottom of the wall, whether we're doing MDF or foam core. How we do that is very simple. First off, I start by cutting my foam core. Mine is cut about 2 1/8 that I'm working with right now for the full entire length of the piece, about 2 1/8 inches high. Then I take this, and this is just a plug pulled out of a hole saw. I just cut a hole in a scrap piece of wood. I took the plug, I sanded it a little bit smoother, and I enlarged the hole slightly to allow a pencil to snugly fit inside the hole. And then I will just run that right along the edge of the track. Once I have my full length in place, I will run this right along, pushing it against the track itself, and I will trace a line which will emulate the surface of the track. And I'll trace that line, I'll make that cut, then I'll have a piece that fits much better, very simply, very much like we have here, where I've traced a piece and cut it. And you can see we've taken care of this dip right here, simply by contour cutting the bottom of the wall. And from there, you can measure up however high you want to measure up on your ends and make your straight cut on top. The side here will be a little bit deeper, but it doesn't matter. It'll fit the bottom of the track. It'll look much more natural. And that same process has to go through whether you're using foam core or MDF. One of the reasons why I'm choosing to use foam core on this section of wall is it's actually much easier to work with. You can just use a knife to do what you need to do. The knife has to be sharp, but you can use a knife to make your cuts and a straight edge whenever necessary. And as long as your knife is held vertically, you've got a great cut and you're ready to proceed. MDF, you generally want to use power tools, things like that. It can be a little bit more difficult to work for some people. For this particular wall, I'm going to use foam core. However, for the wall on this side of the track, I'm going to be using MDF. And the reason is very simple. If you're going to be using fencing on your retaining wall, you probably want to use MDF. I intend to not have fencing on the pit wall because my pit buildings are going to have a gantry and I want to have some access here to get to the cars. So the gantry and the solid pit wall with no fencing will be here. This side here will be where the grandstands are going to be, which are going to be back here. And these will have fencing that comes up from the barrier wall. And I'll accomplish that by drilling 1/8 of an inch holes on this edge going all the way through, and actually the post for the fencing will go through the barrier wall and attach to the infill, outfill, and the sub road bed, and will make a very secure installation and make it very, very strong. So that's my end game, to do that for the fencing on this section. So we've got a very strong pit lane wall. It's a little harder to get your post set up through foam core. It's not as strong, and if you bump it, you're probably gonna mess up the foam foam core pretty bad. Here on the MDF, if you bump it, you're probably just going to bend the post, and then you can just straighten the post right back out. So MDF if you're going to be using posts. Okay, once you've got your bottom contour cut and you've got your ends measured up for the proper height, and you make your line and you make your cut, you've got a piece, and that fits really well. Now the next thing we're going to want to do is take care of the edges, the exposed edges. And a lot of people, this is why they shy away from foam core, because they don't like dealing with the exposed edges. So they switch to MDF. Well, starting with that, MDF, you have to do the same thing. The only thing that's really decent to work with is the face portion of the MDF. The edges and anywhere you cut, I refer to MDF as the great wooden sponge. And these edges will just soak up paint like crazy, and you will have a difficult time painting them straight out, especially if you're using something like an airbrush or spray, and very hard to paint. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to have to seal up the edges on MDF, and we're going to have to seal up the edges whether we use foam core. Both of them are very easy, and I just use different techniques for each one of them. For the MDF, I will just take some regular tight bond glue, and I put a little bit on, and I'll just smear it along the edge and wipe it off where I need to, let it dry, and I'll give it a light sanding with some fine paper. And I usually put a second coat on, let it dry, give it a light sanding with paper, and check your work, and then you're ready for prime. And once you get it primed, that's when you can check your work and make any last minute corrections or adjustments. Get it in primer, get it to look good while it's in primer before you continue any further. And that's usually all it takes to seal up the edges of MDF. I do the exact same thing with the foam core, except I will use just regular spackling. You can even use the lightweight spackling if you wish. And I do the same thing. I'll put it on here and I'll let it dry and I'll sand it. Usually I put a second coat on, let it dry, sand it smooth, and then we'll go through and go through the same steps of priming it, getting it to look the way we want. Once we have the piece in primer looking the way we want, that's where we continue. So let's go over to the bench. I have a piece of foam core already laid out. It's already primed. The edges are already sealed. It's ready to continue. So I'll take you through the steps, and we'll start with the joint lines. Now the joint lines can be arbitrary. You may or may not like the joint lines. Some people don't want to see them. I'm choosing to use the joint lines for one main reason, and that's the simple fact that I tried to tie in elements that are found locally in this region, in this area, and bring them into a layout. And in this case, every retaining wall you see around here, it's all precast segments that are all jointed and everything else. And by bringing this into the pit lane wall, I can bring that element of the local environment outside of the track, bring that into the track, and keep this as a relatable element to the casual observer who shows up at the house and looks at the track, and they'll immediately understand what this is because they see it every day. So I'm going to go with a jointed section for my retaining wall, and I'll show you some techniques I use to get these joints really nice, looking really good the way they are, and I'll show you how we do that. So let's walk over to the bench and let's see what we have. Okay, here we are at the bench, and yes, I'm wearing gloves because I want to make sure that I don't get oil or greasy fingerprints or anything on this freshly primed piece of foam core here. But we can see that I've got my spackling done on the ends and on all the exposed edges, except on the bottom, of course. And if you look, you can tell it's foam core. So this is definitely a piece of foam core, no question about it. And like I said, I've gone through and I put the spackling and sanded it down. I did that 1 or 2 times as necessary, and I went ahead and primed it. And here's the end result. If you're doing MDF, this process is no different once you're at this stage where it's in primer. One thing I will note, if we look right here, you can see that the end of the wall is slightly bulged. It's a little bit thicker right here. It's a little bit of a bulge. I don't know how well you can see it or not, but I did this intentionally so you could see the end result. But if you try to force dry the primer with a heat gun or a blow dryer or something like that, you're going to cause some swelling in the foam core, and you do want to be mindful of that. So I did that on this corner only just to show you what happens. Other than that, I'm not worried about it because this is just a sample test piece anyway to show the technique. But be mindful of that. Once you get your primer on, let it dry naturally and you'll be good to go once that's taken care of. So we got our piece of foam core here, and we're going to do our joint lines like I said. And for doing the joint lines, of course, I use a nice metal straight edge. You want to make sure you use a metal straight edge. I've got a plastic framing square, one of the cheap ones. They were just a few dollars. It's perfect for this. It works fine. And you can see it's got the ledge on either side, and it makes doing this very, very easy. I've got some regular masking tape. I've got a mechanical pencil, and in my case, I'm using a single blade. I prefer to use the individual blades for doing things like this. It's just easier for me personally. It's the way I've been doing it for years. I recommend using a knife handle. I'm not going to tell anybody to use a free blade like this, but I do it because that's what I'm comfortable doing, and that's the technique I've been using for years. But you want to use a nice new blade. This, in case, this is a brand new number 11 blade, and that's what we use to make our cuts. So first thing we need to do, I'm going to go ahead and get this stuff out of the way. And the first thing we need to do is we need to decide how far we want our joints to be. And in my case, they're going to be 3 3/4 or 3.75. Okay, the next thing we want to do is we want to get our tick marks in place for how we want to space out our joints. And like I said, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to begin by measuring. I measure from one end all the way across. This is a 12-inch ruler. This piece is 15 inches long. It'll be more than long enough for me to get all my tick marks in place. And I just carefully start from one end, whatever's convenient, 3 3/4, which is right there. Then I'll come in at 7 1/2. Then I go 1, 2, 3 3/4. 1, 2, 3, which is 11 1/4. Okay, so I've got my 3 tick marks, and if I back measure the end, we can see that we're 3 3/4 of an inch from the opposite end. So we're good. As far as our tick marks go, we've got pretty good spacing. Now, once we have that, I'll take my tri-square, or my framing square, and I'll do it just like this, and I'm right on the tick mark. And I will go through and I will draw my lines. Let me get that lined up just so. Okay, now we've got our 3 lines marked. Here, 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 and they're along the top as well. And now what we're going to want to do is we're going to turn the piece over, and we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to bring these top lines back down to the other side, again using the square. And we want to bring these top lines here back down the other side, again using the square. There's one. Okay, now we have our joint lines that carry all the way over the top and all the way over to each side. I don't know how well you can see them here. There, you can see them, just fine little lines. Carry over the top, back down to the other side. Once your marks are done, now we'll begin with the tape. And where this method came from, this is something I've been doing for years when I build large precision scale radio controlled aircraft, and I have a fiberglass finish that I have primed, and I want to do joint lines. And this is exactly how I've done it on aircraft, and it's a great look. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to begin, and we're going to do the same process here for doing what we have. So I'll start with a piece of regular masking tape, and I just lightly stick it to, I'm using a scrap piece of wood to give me a better surface to work with. And I do like to cut the ends. I just cut the ends real quick, and that way I know the edges are relatively clean, and I'll get this out of here. That's the hard part about using gloves, is everything sticks to them. Then I'll take my metal straight edge, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a narrow strip, and I want to cut that right off the edge of the tape. Just like so. and I will actually pick that piece of tape up and get it out of here, and I will discard it. The reason why, the edge of this tape is never going to be straight. I don't care how well it's cut or how good it looks, it's never going to be precise. So we never want to use the raw edge of the tape for something like this. I always cut a piece and get rid of it. So let me get this tape off my gloves. Okay, now we got a nice straight edge on here. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to come in here and I'm going to cut some very narrow strips. And this is where lighting can be extremely helpful, because we want to be able to, if you got your light behind you, you're going to have a problem with shadowing. So I'm actually going to turn this around and I'm going to try to do this the front way so maybe you can see it a little bit better. And we're going to cut a very narrow strip, maybe in the neighborhood of a 32nd of an inch, nice and narrow. And you want to do a really good job of keeping this locked down the best you can. So I'm going to go ahead and make my cut, and I'll show you the result, because it's going to be hard for me to do this on camera. It'll be hard for me to do it on camera and to see what I'm doing. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll make this cut, and then I'll show you what we have for the end result. Okay, I've already cut one piece here, and you can see that's an extremely thin, narrow piece. And just for the sake of doing it on the camera, I've cut one a little bit wider. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to carefully lift that edge. And this is why I like to use a single blade, because I can just discard the blade when I'm done and everything's good. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to pick that edge up. And you can see we've got a nice thin strip of tape right here. And that's what we're going to use. So let me go ahead and get this piece of tape off. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to set it in place onto our piece here we have right here, and you can see our joint line. And I'm going to leave about a ½ inch or so at the end, and I'm going to, you can't pull it too tight, but you want to set it right on your joint and make sure it follows your line, just like so. And then we're going to wrap it around and bring it down the other side of the line. Okay, so you can see we've got a nice tape line right here going all the way around, and run your finger down and make sure it's stuck down. Okay, and we'll go ahead and we'll do that on the other three, continue the other two lines, and we'll get this avenue here taped up, and we'll continue and see what we have next. Okay, we're back, and I've added my three tape lines here that you can see, and this again is just regular masking tape, and they don't have to be exactly the same width. Of course, you can vary them up if you need to, and sometimes that looks good too. In this case, they're just hand cut. They're all about the same width. So we're going to go ahead and proceed with the next step. Instead of cutting tape like this, of course, you can buy chart pack tape, which is, you can get it in 1/32 of an inch width, 1/64 of an inch width. I tend to use a lot of both. For this here, I'm not going to use the chart pack tape. It's not the cheapest alternative. It's about $8 or $9 a roll, and for the 1/64th. So it's and it can be kind of hard to source sometimes. So I reserve that mainly for aircraft use. I tend to use a lot of both of the 1/32 and the 1/64th. And for this small amount, cutting a simple strip out of masking tape and applying it works just as well. It's just not quite as convenient, but it's fine for the small amount that we're doing. So now that we have our lines in place, I'm going to go ahead and get ready to start adding some primer. And of course, I've made myself a little stand, which is a hunk of wood with a couple toothpicks stuck in it, some holes drilled, and you can see the holes where I've used it before when I was priming. And I'll just go ahead and I'll put this back into the same exact holes like we had before. This makes a nice little stand for the continuation and to go ahead and do my priming. Now, what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to put 2 light coats of primer, and then I'm going to follow it up with probably 3 heavier coats, not soaking wet. We don't want to douse it down. We just want to get a few coats of primer on, and we only have to worry about the taped areas. So if you just want to shoot this way with a rattle can, you're fine, but don't be afraid to paint the whole thing. It doesn't really matter either way, and usually it never hurts adding another coat of primer anyway. So I'm going to take this outside, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use just regular rattle can high build automotive primer that you can get at any auto parts store. And it's the same primer I've used on this before anyway. So I'm going to give that a few coats of primer, and we'll come back and I'll show you what we have next. Okay, we're back, and I've put on several coats of primer on top of the tape joint areas that we can, probably can't even see them, but you can definitely feel them. We get a little closer, maybe you can see them. It's hard to tell. And my apologies about the last video sequence of knocking things out of frame. That was a mistake on my part. I apologize for that. But I think everybody got the gist of the information. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this thing off the stand now. The primer's had a good chance to dry. And now that we have this piece here with primer over the tape joints, now what we're going to do is we're going to take some very fine sandpaper. In this case I'm using 320. And we want to go over the areas where we taped lightly at first. And we want to start getting these in. And we want to get them to the point where we can see the tape. So I will generally go in a circular fashion, and I will move outside that area a little bit. I like to do a general sand on the primered part anyway. So we're going to go ahead and just keep moving and just keep it going, and we're going to sand it down. And once you start breaking the edge, you'll find that you can go a little bit easier. And as you're going through, don't use a lot of pressure, but you can see the tape is going to start coming into view. I can start to see it to come into view now. And the reason why this is important is this is going to give you a nice edge all the way around as we're continuing with our joints. So make sure you sand it down to where you can, the tape becomes visible. And then you can finish up with a well-used block if you wish, just to help keep everything a little straighter. And we'll go through this way. And you can see now, I think you can see it. If we get in just the right light, you can start to see our tape starting to show itself. So we'll go ahead and get another little piece. And if you've got wet dry paper, you might be better off using wet, but I generally do this dry just because of the simple fact that I'm not crazy about getting a lot of water on it at this stage. Okay, it's looking pretty good. It's starting to get there. You can see the line a little bit now, a little bit more well defined, and we'll just keep working it until we expose the tape. Okay, now that we've got a nice, you can see it right here, we can see our blue tape. We've got that all the way around. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to carefully go back in, and we're going to dig back into the foam side, and we're going to lift up our tape, and we're going to start removing our tape all the way around the joint. Very carefully, and I sanded through the tape there, so I'll have to come back and get the other edge. Let's carefully lift up the edge of the tape, and I can pull it back along itself. Okay, good. Now you can see what we have, if you look at it and see if I can get it in focus, is you have a nice recessed joint right here, because we built the thickness up with the primer and then we removed the tape, so we've got a nice little recessed joint. Now if you look at your joint very closely, you'll find it's a little rough. So at that point I will take a round toothpick and I'll just very carefully scrape along the inside of the edge like so, and clean up any additional paint residue or anything else that doesn't need to be there. So looks like we've got a nice joint here. Okay, and that's all we do to make a nice recessed joint. And I'll take a picture and see if I can get a closer shot of this so you can see it a little bit better. But that's all we do to get a nice joint line here. And when we do the painting and everything else, that joint's pretty much going to disappear. But we'll bring it back when we do the washes, and I'll show you how to do that. and that'll actually be in the next video when we go ahead and we paint this to make it look more like concrete. So we'll go ahead, we'll end this episode here, and we'll pick it up in the next video, and you can see how we're going to go ahead and get this thing painted. I'm going to go ahead and sand and get rid of the rest of my joint lines here, and we'll get this prepped for paint, and that's when we'll take it into the paint booth, and I'll show you how we paint this to make it look a little bit more like concrete. So we'll wrap this episode up here. Again, I want to thank everybody for all the subscriptions and the likes, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to hit me up. I do the best I can to answer everything I can. And other than that, I want everybody to just please enjoy your weekend. Have a great day. Stay safe. Take care of your families. And as always, thank you for watching. We'll see you soon.